Well, I remember when my kids were little playing hide and seek with them. We played hide and seek in the house, and the kids were really good at it. They were probably better at it than I was, but part of the reason is because they were small. And it was a lot easier to find hiding spaces. And they were really good. In fact, I remember both of my kids did this at one time or another. They would hide in their pile of stuffed animals. And as long as they were still, you could not see them. And every once in a while, you see something move, and you're like, there it is. And you'd look closer, and then you'd see a couple eyes in there. But they were really good at hiding and stuff. But for myself, there were not that many places I could hide. I mean, one time I hid inside the shower with the curtain drawn, and that took them a while to find me. But, there weren't very many places I would fit. I was too big. And so once they found those good hiding spots, I didn't have a lot of options. And so I remember sometimes just going and laying down behind the couch. You know what? They didn't care because they still got to find me. And at least I got to rest a little bit while we were playing. But the thing is it's one thing to run and hide when you're playing a game. It's a completely different thing when you're running and hiding because your life is in danger. When your life is on the line. David is running from Saul. He's hiding from Saul, but Saul keeps finding out where he is. And kind of coming to the area, and David has to then run again. Saul is seeking David, not because they're playing a game, but because he wants to kill David. David is seeking someone as well. David is seeking God. Because he's looking for God's help and for God's direction. And because David wants to do the right thing. If we, as God's people, if we want to do the right thing, if we want to live for God, if we want to keep going when things get difficult, when things get hard, if we want to keep going when people fail us, or when people flat out attack us, then we need to seek God. Because you will find that when it comes down to it, there is the only good place to hide is in God. Let's jump into our passage this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Beginning in verse 1, we see here that David is stopping to ask for direction. Chapter 23, verse 1. Now they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand. And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Now, as we read this, beginning of this chapter, we appear to have backed up in time a little bit from where we ended the last chapter. And the reason for that is we're now finding out what David was doing while Saul was killing priests, or at least having Doeg kill the priests. We get that because the next verse, we haven't read that yet, but verse 6 tells us that the runaway priest arrives at Keilah and meets up with David. And so we seem to have backed up to the time where Saul was killing the priests. And so the Philistines have attacked this Israelite town of Keilah. And they are taking their harvested crops. And so the people have planted crops, they've harvested them, they brought them to the threshing floor where they can beat out the grain, and they've been working on them. And then the Philistines, after the Israelites have done all the work and have all the food, are coming and they're taking it from them. Not only that, they're taking their food. And so David is told about it. He hears that this is happening, and his immediate response is to consider, should I go down there and save these people from the Philistines? You might be surprised that he's doing this because he's on the run, but that's his immediate thought. Now, think about this for a minute. David, what has David been doing ever since he stood up and faced Goliath? He's been fighting Philistines. Saul has been sending him out to fight the Philistines, to protect Israel against their attacks and those kinds of things. That's what he's been doing. He's kind of taken on the role of deliverer from the Philistines. Now, do you remember when Saul was anointed as king, what did God say he would do? Deliver Israel from who? The Philistines. Did Saul ever do that? No. David now, who has been anointed to be king, to replace Saul, what has David been doing? Fighting the Philistines, delivering Israel from the Philistines. So David has taken on that role. Even though he is not yet king, he's taken on that role, and he is actually doing what the king was supposed to be doing. And he's delivering Israel from the Philistines. And so here, even though he is on the run from Saul, his immediate thought when he hears about these Philistines' attacks is, should I go save them? Should I go deliver these people, these Israelites, help them deliver them from the Philistines? And so what does David do? When he considers this, what's he do? He asks God, should I go? Now, he's probably here asking God, like through the prophet Gad. We had heard that Gad was with David before, and so it's possible that that's how he's doing this. We don't know exactly, we're not told. But it's likely that he's doing this through the prophet Gad and asking God, what should I do? Well, God tells him, go and save the people of Israel. But then when David mentions that to his men, they're not ready to do that. They're scared. They're like, we're already running from Saul. Isn't that bad enough? But now you want us to go and attack the Philistine army? And so David says, okay, let me double check. So he does. He goes and he asks God again, should I do this? And God says, yes. And he says it very clearly this time. He says, yes, you should go. And he says, I will deliver them into your hand. In other words, I will cause you to win. That's all David needed to hear. And he and his men immediately go out and they fight against the Philistines and deliver the people of Keilah from the Philistines. Then look at verse 6. It says, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now we get this. This is just a very simple statement that explains how David now, going on into the future, how David now is able to inquire of God and ask God some very specific questions. Because we're told that when he came with the ephod. Now this was a article of clothing, like a breast piece that the priest would wear. And in the ephod was the Urim and the Thummim. We've talked about those before. The two stones that God had given Israel as a way of asking him questions. And so they could ask, like, is it Saul or Jonathan? Is it, is it a yes or no question? And depending on which stone the priest would reach in after asking God, praying, would reach in and pull that stone out. Depending on which stone came out, gave them the answer. Now, sounds kind of superstitious to us, and I would not recommend trying to do that today. But God specifically gave Israel this way of talking to him or communicating with him. And so they were able to do this. And so God gave them this way of doing it. And the priest had the ephod with him when he came and ran to David. And so what we see happening here is Saul has continued to push God away, to distance himself from God, and has even killed his priests. But David, who is following God and is being faithful to God, what does he have now with him? He has the priests with him. So Saul has distanced himself from God. David is following God, and God has sent his priests to David. And so now David has this way that he can inquire of God. God has provided a way for David to communicate with him in this special way. God is helping his faithful servant. But this verse comes here, and it stands right in the middle of this first section. And in the first part of this first section, he has inquired of God. In the next part we're going to read in a minute, he will inquire of God again. And so the statement comes here in the middle of where he is seeking God. David has already sought God for direction, and he's going to seek after God for direction. And I believe this statement is emphasizing that he is doing that. He's seeking God for direction. And I don't want us to miss that. It's because what do we need to do in life? We need to seek God. We need to seek him in his direction for our life. Well, let's keep reading then in verse 7. It says, now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. See, Keilah was a fortified city. So it was a city where they had, it was hard to break into. And so people, when they were running from an enemy, could go in there and hide themselves in the city. And then the enemy might set up a siege or whatever. But this is what Saul's thinking. Look what David's done. He's gone to a city. Now he's going to be stuck in there. And now I can go and set siege and I can capture him. But the interesting thing is what Saul says before that. He says, look, God has delivered him into my hand. What makes Saul think he has the right to think that God would help him this way? I mean, after all that Saul has done, he has opposed God left and right. He is not following God. He is not listening to God. But now when he thinks that that David is caught, he says, God's done this for me. It's a little odd, to say the least. And so he continues then, verse 8, he says, and Saul summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. And so he's going to ask God questions. Verse 10, then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. So Saul's not going to just destroy David. He's going to tear down that city and kill everyone to get to David. He's going to destroy the city on his account. In verse 11, will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? In other words, will they be so scared of Saul that they're willing to give me up? He says, will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. David might have been a little surprised by that, because what did he just do? He just saved all those people's lives. He rescued them from the Philistines. And now he says, but are they going to turn me in? Yep, they will. Verse 13, then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. So they find out that Saul's coming, that the men are going to give him up, and they just scatter. They say, well, let's just run, hide wherever we can, and I guess we'll gather up later. But so they just run and they hide wherever they can find to hide. But notice the last statement of verse 5, and we want to bring this out. It says, so David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. Again, you might expect them to show some gratitude, to stand up for David, to do whatever they can to help him. But David finds out, nope, they're just going to turn him over to Saul. Now, David could have been offended by that. I think he probably understood their situation. They're afraid of Saul as well. And if they help Saul, then they make themselves an enemy of Saul, and Saul will attack them as well. I think David has understood that. But at the same time, he could have been offended by that. I just saved your lives. Why don't you help me? He could have gotten mad. He could have pouted. He could have decided to act like Saul and kill them all. I just helped you. Now you're not going to show any gratitude to me? I'll just kill all you. He could have done all these things, but how does he react? He finds out they're not going to help me. Okay, let's go. And they scatter. He just lets it go. He doesn't take offense to it. It doesn't bother him. He just goes. And I bring that out. I want to make that point because you know what? Sometimes people that you help, sometimes people that you have treated well, may not treat you with the same kind of help or the same kind of care. And we don't have to be offended by that. We don't have to hold grudges. We don't have to worry about that or be anxious about that. We can just simply let it go. And when I read what Jesus says, I think Jesus' response to a situation like this would be, well, just forgive. And let it go. So we don't have to take offense to everything. We can just let it go and move on. So David is out hiding from Saul. But Saul is relentless in his pursuit of David. Look at verse 14. And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. And he's saying, I'll be your right-hand man when you're king. Saul my father also knows this. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. And so, did you catch this statement? It says, but God did not give him into his hand. Saul is pursuing him, but God did not give him into his hand. In here, we see the constant faithfulness of God. Saul is constantly seeking David, pursuing David, looking for David so he can kill him. We're told he looked every day. So this is his one consuming passion. The thing that drives him in the morning. I got to get up and find David today. Every day he's pursuing David. But he never found him. Why? Because God didn't let him. It's quite simple. God did not give him into his hand. Now, it sounds like David saw Saul out there looking for him, but Saul never found David or saw David. On the other hand, Jonathan was able to find David. Now, I have to make a correction. A few weeks ago, I said this was the last time we have evidence that David and Jonathan saw each other. I forgot about this incident. This is the last time they see each other. But Jonathan comes and meets David. He finds him and he comes for just a short visit to encourage him. But how did he encourage him? It wasn't, you can make it. You'll get through this. Come on, just stick in there. Just day after day, to one step at a time, you'll get through this, positive statements. It wasn't just positive statements on that. You're strong enough, you'll get through. What did he do? He reminded him of the promise of God. Now that's good encouragement. That's a good friend. He said, look what God has promised you. Look what God has said. He says, my father Saul, he can't kill you. Why? Because God has promised you're going to be king. If he kills you, you can't be king. So you don't have to worry about it. Saul's not going to catch you. He's not going to get you. And so he encourages him by telling him the promises of God and assuring him that those promises will come to be. That God will make it happen. That's good encouragement. So David doesn't have to worry about Saul. Obviously, he doesn't want to walk up to him and let him kill him. But he says, you don't need to worry. God's not going to let him get you. Because God's going to make you king. Let's keep reading verse 19. Then the Ziphites, went up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hachilah, which is south of Jeshimon? Now come down, O king, according to all that is in your heart's desire to come down, and our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand." So the Ziphites here, they're opportunists, kind of like Doeg. They want to ingratiate themselves with the king, with Saul. And they know where David is, at least the general area, and they say, "Hey, he's here. You should come down and we'll help you find him. We'll tell you where he is." Verse 21, and Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, for you have compassion on me." Another funny statement or ironic statement from Saul. "May you be blessed by the Lord." In other words, may God bless you. He's asking God to bless these people. For what reason? Because they show compassion on him. Does Saul know anything about compassion right now? Sure doesn't seem like it. He's not showing any compassion, but he is so happy that someone showed compassion on him. He's back in his whining, complaining. "Why doesn't anybody help me?" Well, probably because what you're doing is wrong. But why doesn't anybody help me? And he's like, "Oh, finally. Oh, you're so good for showing compassion to me. You're so good for helping me do this." So he continues on, verse 22. "Go, make yet more sure. Know and see the places where his foot is, and who has seen him there. For it is told me that he is very cunning. See therefore and take note of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with sure information. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, I will search him out among all the thousands of Judah." So he says, I want you to go and do really good recon. Because he's really tricky. Kind of like my kids and the stuffed animals. Until there was a little movement, you never knew where they were. He says, I could go and you could say he's there, but where is he? I don't see it. He says, go and do very good reconnaissance and then come back and get me and I will go. But then he's very confident. He says, if there's thousands of people, I will find David. So go do this for me and then I'll come and I'll do it. Verse 24. And they arose and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the wilderness of Moab in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And Saul and his men went to seek him. And David was told, so he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Moab. When Saul heard that, he pursued after David in the wilderness of Moab. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, as Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. A messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. So Saul turned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place is called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi. And so you see what's happening. Saul's coming down and he and his army are chasing after David and his men. They're chasing him around a mountain. David's running, trying to get away, and Saul's chasing after him. They're coming around the mountain. And what is Saul doing? He's closing in on them. He's catching them. So Saul's getting closer and closer and closer to David. And this is where the heighten comes. And just when he's so close and he's about, what happens? A messenger comes to Saul and says, you got to come quick. The Philistines are attacking. What a coincidence. This was no coincidence. You see, God intervened. And the messenger came and said, come on. And Saul had to break off his pursuit of David and go take care of the immediate threat from the Philistines. Because God sent the Philistines to attack Israel, to occupy Saul, so he could not pursue David. God used the Philistines to protect his servant David. Is that surprising? It might be unexpected, but David was saved because of the Philistines. Well, really because God used the Philistines. You see, God can use even Philistines to protect his people or to fulfill his purposes. You never know who God is going to use. You never know where your help is going to come from. Where God's help is going to come from. He can use anyone to support his people. I just want to give you a little example, a modern example from my own life where something like this happened. When I was in seminary, I found myself at one point out of work. Now, I was going to school, but I was also working. I had a family to support, and I think Joanna was a baby at that time. And so there were all four of us, and I had a family to support. I had to work and go to school. But I found myself out of work. Now, I didn't have loads of money in the bank because I all went to school. And so I needed a job. And at that time when I was looking for a job, there just happened to be this guy. He was not a Christian, not a believer, not even religious. But somebody had told him, you should advertise. He did construction or carpentry remodeling. And he says, you should advertise at the seminary because you'll get good workers. Which is probably, that's a good testimony to the people at the seminary, I guess. But he says, you should advertise at the seminary because you'll get good workers. And so he said, that seems like good sense. So he did. He advertised at the seminary. At the same time that I was looking for a job, he was looking for help. I ended up working for this guy for probably only about 3 months or so, because after I worked for him for a while, the jobs dried up and he didn't need the help. And at the same time that those jobs dried up and he didn't need help, we found another guy who was doing the same kind of work but needed help, a Christian man who I then worked with. I went to work for, and I worked with him for the rest of the time I lived in Dallas, for about 5 years. But there was those few months where I needed money. I needed a job, and there was no job. And I ended up working for this man. And I look at that and I say, you know what? God provided for me in those 3 months through a man who was not a believer and who I would have had absolutely no contact with. There's no way I would have met him or interacted with him if it wasn't for the fact that somebody said, you should advertise at the seminary because you'll get good workers. God can provide any way, and God will choose whoever he chooses to help his people and to support his people. So the chase is heating up. Saul has gotten really close once, and he's not about to stop. Let's keep reading. Chapter 24, verse 1 and 2. It says, when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the Wild Goats Rocks. Sounds like a place in the zoo, the Wild Goats Rocks. Anyways, that's where he was. But you see there, as soon as Saul's done chasing or dealing with the immediate Philistine problem, he's right back to trying to kill David. He finds out the area where David is hiding, and he goes to find him. But did you catch what he does? He takes 3,000 of his best soldiers, 3,000 chosen men of all Israel, 3,000 of his best soldiers. Seems like he's overdoing it a little bit of overkill. That's 5 times as many men as what David has, and the best that he can find. But see, what Saul is doing is he's counting on the numbers and on the skill of those men to give him a victory so that he could find David. Of course, if Saul would have realized that he was fighting against God, he would realize that none of that would matter. That it's not enough. It won't help him. Keep reading verse 3. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. So this is an interesting little scene here. While Saul is out looking for David, Saul takes a little break and goes deep into a cave to relieve himself. Now that phrase, relieve himself, is literally cover his feet. But this is a euphemism. Today, we would say he went in to use the restroom. So that's what he's done. He's gone into this cave to use the restroom, to relieve himself. That means he is all by himself. You wouldn't even take your bodyguards with you for this business. And so he has gone into this cave all by himself. David's men are there and they see him and they assume that means that God has given David the opportunity to kill Saul. To finish this whole thing. This is your chance to do whatever you want. And so what does David do? He sneaks over to Saul and he cuts off a piece of the hem of his robe, which I just think is amazing that David was actually able to sneak quietly enough to cut off a robe, a piece of his robe without Saul noticing. But he does it. He sneaks over there and does this. But as soon as he does it, he regrets it. Now, he probably feels bad because even this small thing of cutting off a little piece of his robe, even this small thing could be seen as disrespectful or could be considered an act of rebellion against the king. And David has never been about rebelling. He's never been about taking the throne by force or about being disloyal to Saul in any way. You notice that throughout this thing, Saul has been after him, attacking him. David has never shown any disloyalty to him. He's just run away. But David refuses to harm Saul. Why? Because he's God's anointed. Now, this may sound strange to us because we know that Saul has been rejected by God as king. But even though he has been rejected by God as king, and even though God is no longer helping him as king, David still held Saul in this special place of honor because he was the Lord's anointed. You see, Saul had been set apart to God and for his service. And that fact will never change. Even if he isn't acting upon it, even if Saul isn't doing what he was supposed to do, he was set apart to God and for his service. And David sees that and says he's in a unique position and he is worthy of our respect. And we cannot do this. We cannot harm the Lord's anointed. So he refuses to hurt him. Now, David's men, on the other hand, they don't see it quite the same. And they think that David is basically just wasting an opportunity. But David restrains them and convinces them, and probably with a little bit of trouble. The words are used give the idea that he had to really put his foot down. But he stops them. He does not allow them to hurt Saul as well, because he is the Lord's anointed. Well, then Saul gets up and leaves the cave without knowing that any of that happened, or that there was ever anyone else in the cave with him. So let's look and see what happens after that. Verse 8. Afterwards, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. You see, David is showing respect and honor to Saul because he's the king, because he's the Lord's anointed. Whether he's acting like it or not, David is still respecting the position. He's respecting who he is. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks you harm'?" Now, this is an interesting statement because, first of all, David's just basically saying, why would you listen to people who are trying to egg you on and say, "Hey, David's after you"? But David may actually just being respectful or, what's the word? I won't, not politically correct, but gracious maybe in the way he's saying this. He's basically saying, why do you think I'm after you? But he doesn't want to blame the king directly. He says, why do you listen to people who say I'm after you? Because who is it that really believes David's after him? Saul. He's the only one we've heard say that. But he says, why do you listen? In other words, why do you think I'm after you? Verse 10, behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against the Lord, against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, the corner of your robe. Now, stop there a second. You see that phrase, what he's calling Saul? He's calling Saul my Lord. He calls him my father. And he is showing as much respect as he possibly can to Saul because he is the king, because he is the Lord's anointed. In verse 11, see, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hand. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. See, he says, I obviously could have killed you, but I didn't. I chose not to. That's not my intention. Even though you are treating me that way, you would have killed me. I did not do that to you. Verse 12. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. So he calls on God to be the judge. He calls on God to take care of the problem. And he does say, may God avenge me. So he's, in the way, he's kind of alluding to the fact that you're the one that's in the wrong here. And if God judges, you're going to be on the receiving end of the judgment. But he says, but it's not my job. I'm not going to do that. Verse 14, and whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog and a flea. David's saying, I'm not that big of important. If you kill me, what's it going to change for you? Nothing. So why would you chase after me? Verse 15, may the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it, and plead my case and deliver me from your hand. As soon as David had finished speaking these words, Saul said, is that your voice, my son David? So he recognized him. And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Now, why is Saul crying here? Now, most people don't think that it's out of regret, like, oh, I shouldn't have done this. Most people think it's just out of self-pity. And you'll see why in a minute, because we're going to find out what Saul realizes at this time. But that it's just self-pity, like, why is everything bad happening to me? I'm going to miss out on those things that I want. But you'll see here when we get there. Verse 17, he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? He says, what you did doesn't make sense, but I'm glad you did it. So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, catch this, behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. He says, I know that you're going to be king. See, up until this point, Saul's never admitted this. We've heard him allude to it. He told Jonathan, as long as David lives, you're never going to be king. But at this point, he just admits it straight out. He says, I know that you'll be king. Verse 21, swear to me therefore by the Lord, since I know you'll be king, swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. This is the same request that Jonathan made of him. Remember? Because what would happen when a new king arose, he would kill the entire family of the old king. Because there were no rivals. There was no one to say, I'm the rightful heir to the throne. He would just kill everyone. So Saul says, please don't do that to me. Well, David's perfectly willing to do that because he's already made the promise to Jonathan, but he says, verse 22, and David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Now, it would seem that at this point that this whole mess, this whole life and death game of hide and seek would be over. The struggle is done and finished. But it's not. And it's not going to get better. And this is hinted at by that last statement. What did it say? Saul went home, but where did David go? Did David go home? No. If it was all over, he would have gone home too. To his wife, his house. But he doesn't. It says that he stayed there in the stronghold, in the wilderness. You see, David still doesn't trust Saul. Even with all that Saul just said, I know that you'll be king, you were more righteous, you're treating me well, I shouldn't have. He still doesn't trust Saul, and he doesn't go home. He's still going to avoid Saul. And so, this game of hide and seek will continue. But in this chapter, we see the amazing restraint by David. Amazing restraint. You see, David wants to do what is right before God. He could have killed Saul and be done with this. He's living every day with his life in danger because Saul is alive. He could have been done with it. But he restrains himself because he wants to do what is right before God. He could have justified killing Saul. Think about it. Saul has rejected God and therefore has been rejected by God as king. David has already been anointed and told that he would be king, that he was to replace Saul. But he can't as long as Saul is alive and running around as king and trying to kill him. And he could have said, it's just right. But David recognizes that it's not his place to kill Saul. That God has said, you will be king. But when God wants to make him king, then God will take care of it. And he will establish him as king. That Saul will die, however God sees fit. Because who's in charge of life and death? God. And so David says, that's not my place. God will do it when it's time. He could have justified it and said, well, Saul's trying to kill me, so it's just self-defense. But again, this is God's job. And he hasn't told David to take care of it for him. He could have justified it and simply said, he deserves it. Which we probably agree. He deserves it. He hasn't done anything right. He disobeys God. He's killed the priests. He deserves to die. But that's still not a good reason to do wrong. For David to do wrong. And so he could have justified, but he doesn't. He says, I'm going to let God do what's right. David wants to do what is right in God's eyes. But the thing is these kinds of justifications are exactly what the way people in our world think. It's what people in our world do. But it's not godly. That's not how God would respond to situations. We don't have to retaliate when people hurt us. We don't have to hurt those who hurt us. In fact, what the righteous would do, what godly people would do, people who are following Jesus would do, is to restrain themselves in order to do what is right. In order to obey God, and in order to honor God. Because isn't that what Jesus did? If we're talking about following Jesus, that means we're going to be like Jesus. We're going to act like Jesus. We're going to follow in his ways. Isn't that what he did? When people arrested him for absolutely no reason, when people beat him, when people spit on him, when people whipped him, when they nailed him to a cross, all of which he did not deserve, but he did in order to save us from our sins, to take the punishment for our sins so we could be forgiven. But when Jesus did every bit of that, did he ever once retaliate? Did he even speak a word in retaliation? No. He did what God wanted him to do. He obeyed the Father. We don't have to hurt back. We don't have to retaliate. We don't have to hold grudge. We can just let things go. We can forgive. In fact, what did Jesus do on the cross? He said, Father, forgive them. Why? For they don't know what they're doing. Now, I'm going to say something very honest. Sometimes it can be hard to act like Jesus. Is that right? Sometimes it can be hard to act like Jesus, but that is what we're called to do. If we're following Jesus, then what do? We strive to be like Jesus. We seek God and try to be like Jesus. It can be hard to show grace and mercy to those who don't deserve it. But that's exactly what God did. When he showed us grace and mercy, did we deserve it? No. We were sinners, condemned sinners on our way to hell, and Jesus died in our place so we could be forgiven. That's grace, that's mercy. Well, that's the definition of grace and mercy. We don't deserve it. He did good to those who didn't deserve it. It can be hard to do that. But you know what? As God's people, God gives us the strength to do what he calls us to do. He gives us the strength to do what we need to do. That means that we just need to seek him and get strength from him. Now, I know you've heard me say that over and over and over again. What do we need to do? We need to seek God. We need to spend time with God. We need to pray. We need to read the Bible. We need to be in church. We need to worship. We need to seek God. I've said it over and over again in this series in Samuel and really for the last 6 years as I've been here. Why? Because it's absolutely true and it's absolutely so important. If you want to follow Jesus, you have to seek God. If you want to be like Jesus, you have to spend time with him. That is what we have to do. It's the only way to live for God. Now, one time when I was a kid, I was in junior high or high school, I was playing hide and seek. I was at our church, and there was a group of us playing it, and I found this great hiding spot. In fact, I went there and I was perfectly comfortable. I could stretch out so I wasn't having to be all contorted or awkward. I could sit there. I was comfortable and no one could find me. In fact, I was there for so long I wondered if we were still playing. I'm just listening, trying to hear, but I didn't want to just walk out and give up my spot. But no one ever found me. It was the perfect hiding spot for a game of hide and seek. But life is not a game. As I said at the beginning today, if we want to do what's right, if we want to live for God, and we want to keep going when things get hard, and when people fail us, or when people outright attack us, we need to seek God. Because you'll find that in the end, when it comes right down to it, the only good place to hide is in God. We need to seek him. We need to spend that time with him. We need to seek him, his direction. We seek him and then we can hide in him. We can rest in him, knowing that he's got it. We can have confidence knowing that he is with us and that he will do what is best. You see, God's in control. We saw that throughout this passage, right? I mean, Saul is chasing after David and God says, oh, you got too close. You're out of here. And God is in control. And we can have confidence in our God. And we know that he loves us. So if God is in control and he loves you, is he going to do what's bad for you? No, he's going to do what's best for you. He's got you. But that means you need to stay close to him and you need to keep following him. And whenever you play hide and seek, or whenever you see kids playing hide and seek, you have this little reminder now turn those words around. Instead of hide and seek, let's think about seeking and hiding. You can be reminded to seek God, to draw near to Him, to look for His direction, spend time with Him, and then hide in Him, rest in Him. Seek and hide.